Genesis chapter 9. We left off last week, and like I said, there were some things that we were going to mention. We did end up getting through a lot of it anyway, but there's a couple of things that I did want to pull up as well just before we finish up with this and then continue on. In Genesis chapter 9, let's just start off in verse 13. And we'll read a couple verses here and then we'll get going. So Genesis chapter 9, verse 13. I do set my bow in the cloud, and it shall be for a token of a covenant between me and the earth. And it shall come to pass when I bring a cloud over the earth that the bow shall be seen in the cloud, and I will remember my covenant which is between me and you and every living creature of all flesh. And the water shall no more become a flood to destroy all flesh. And the bow shall be in the cloud, and I will look upon it, that I may remember the everlasting covenant between God and every living creature of all flesh that is upon the earth. Father, we want to thank you for the opportunity that we have to study your word, and as we go through the passages, again, may we allow your word to be the final authority in all things. It's in Christ's name we pray. Amen. All right, so last week, we were going through the bow, and we were talking about the issue there. And one of the things that we really, what I really wanted to make sure that we understood there is the big issue is the connection between the bow and God's glory, right? And of course, we went over to Ezekiel chapter 1, and we saw how those two things were connected. And then, of course, what's interesting is you have the exact opposite that takes place shortly after that with Noah. And we'll get into that and do a couple of things with that real quick before moving on. But when we see that issue of the glory, go with me. Go with me to let's see. Let's go over to Exodus. Is that where I want to go? Let me double check, make sure in my mind. Well, let's not go to Exodus yet. We'll stay here real quick. I was trying to think if I wanted to do something or not. We might not yet. But one of the things that we see that's taking place here is the issue of how those two things are connected or should be connected in a way that should make some sense to us as we take a look at His throne and His glory and how those two things relate. And what God's doing here is it's a promise. And of course we talked about this. Notice when we look here in verse 15, he says, I will remember my covenant, which is between me and you and every living creature of all flesh, and the water shall no more become a flood to destroy all flesh. And the bow shall be in the cloud, and I will look upon it, that I may remember the everlasting covenant between God and every living creature of all flesh that is upon the earth. Now, when we look at those two verses, again, we talked about it last week. Does God need to have, is it possible for God to forget something? Right, and of course, that's one of the things we talked about before. But when we take a look at this, and again, it's not, okay, I'm going to have to remember this because I might possibly forget it, but it's just a reminder, this is what I'm doing. Now, when we take a look at the glory, when you talk about the glory of God, one of the things when God's talking to Moses and Moses says, show me your glory. And God's response to that was what? Well, I can't. But what's interesting is he says, when I walk past, you're going to see my glory. And part of his glory is his grace and his mercy. And if you stop and you think about what's going on, what did God do with the very first flood? The reason that he had the flood is why? Because of the hardness of man's heart, right? And you stop and you think about that. And what God's doing is he's bringing up this issue of the bow and dealing with his glory and how those things work together. Part of his glory is who he is as God. What is mercy? We've talked about this before. What is mercy? Mercy is withholding something that you deserve, right? And so when God brings this bow up, what's he doing? Do you deserve to be flooded again? And think about that. Because of the hardness of man's heart, and of course what we find out, and we're going to get there maybe. I don't know if we'll get there today or not. But what do we see? What do we see even shortly after this? What do we find out about Shem, Ham, and Japheth and the things that take place with them? But God's bringing this reminder of what? His mercy. Well, also what has to do with that is grace, right? He talks about he's going to be merciful to whom he's going to be merciful, and he's going to be gracious to whom he's going to be gracious. So those two things are always going to go together. Mercy is withholding something that you deserve. Grace is I'm going to give you something that you don't. All right? And so when we take a look at this, and those are those things that I want us to keep in mind as we're going through here, because does man deserve to have been destroyed again? I mean, we'll see very clearly that they do, right? And what happens is that bow is there to remind us and him that what? I'm going to rather show mercy. And what it does, everybody gets caught up in all that vengeful, wrathful God in the Old Testament. We have no clue how merciful and graceful he actually is until you actually read the book. And all that is somebody that doesn't understand the Bible, and what they're trying to do is to get rid of the God that they knew and that they know existed, right? Hold your place here. Go over to Romans chapter 1. Go over to Romans chapter 1. And again, we've talked about some of these things before, but just to kind of put these things into perspective, in Romans chapter 1, we'll start here at verse 18. All right, Romans chapter 1, verse 18. And we talked about some of these things, but I want us to see what the first 11 chapters of the book of the Bible do. We find out here in Romans chapter 1. All right, we've talked about these things before, but notice this. Romans chapter 1, verse 18. For the wrath of God is revealed from heaven against all ungodliness and unrighteousness of men who hold the truth in unrighteousness. Now, one of the things that's interesting here is when you take a look at the wrath right here that's being revealed, what's the wrath that's being revealed? He's going to tell us what the wrath is, right? The wrath that he's talking about here that's being revealed isn't the fact that God's going to destroy the earth one day with fire and all that stuff, but what's the wrath of God here? And he gives us an idea of what's taking place, and it takes us all the way back to the first 11 chapters of Genesis. Notice here in verse 19. Because. Why is it that there's wrath to begin with? Because that which may be known of God is manifest in them, for God hath showed it unto them. Now, of course, one of the things that when you look at that is, what is it that we know? God is manifested where? That he exists. In them. There's something in you that tells you that you're not as great as what you think you are. There's somebody else that's outside of you that you're going to be held accountable to one day. And it's interesting because this is the first part of the gospel. And oftentimes we forget about this part of the gospel. Because normally we say, well, the gospel is Jesus Christ died. Okay, but why did he die? You have to back up because there's more to the gospel than just his death, burial, and resurrection. Why did he die? And what happens is, this is part of the gospel. Paul backs up and he does this. Notice, 4, verse 20. Here's how he showed it unto them. For the invisible things of him from the creation of the world are clearly seen, being understood by the things that are made, even his eternal power and Godhead, so that they are without excuse. All right? So, of course, again, you look at that verse and what do you find out? We're without excuse. Everything that we see, visible and invisible, those things that we see, the things that we see tell us the things that are invisible, they do exist, right? Notice, here's the interesting thing. Being understood by the things that are made, notice, even his eternal power and Godhead. Not only can we know that God exists by looking around, but we can also know what? His eternal power and Godhead. Those are not tangible things that you can smell, touch, taste, feel, The only way you can know that is the book there's something in you that tells you that God exists and you're going to be held accountable to him one day, right? Notice in verse 21, because that when they knew God, was there a time in the first part of the Genesis that we've gone through so far that they knew God? The answer is yes. Notice, but because that when they knew God, they what? Glorified him not as God. Neither were thankful, but became vain in their imaginations, and their foolish heart was darkened. Now, when we looked at that in the passages before, in Genesis, what did we find out about the imaginations of man was what? Only evil continually, right? Here we find out that they're what? They're vain in their imaginations. And that word vain means what? It's empty. You ever been told when you're a little kid, you're just an empty-headed, you don't know what you're talking about? That's the idea, right? And so when you look at this, he says, but became vain in their imaginations. Notice that became vain in their imaginations. You ever thought about that? And think about the wrath that God's talking about here, that Paul's revealing. We're going to see what it is. Neither were they thankful, but became vain in their imaginations, and their foolish heart was darkened. Professing themselves to be wise, they became fools, and changed the glory of the uncorruptible God. Now, that glory is what we're talking about, right? They changed the glory of the uncorruptible God into an image. Now, when you start looking at images, the whole idea with images, what is that? Where do images come from? Your imagination, right? And if your imagination is only evil, continual, or vain, what is it that your image that you're going to create, what's it going to be? It's going to be that, right? It's going to be an idol. It's going to be something that you're going to create based on what you think God is. And that's what they've done. Notice, and changed the glory of the uncorruptible God. By the way, can we, in and of ourselves, change the glory of God in who he is? No. What is it that they're doing is, did they know God? Yes. Did they know his glory? Yes. Did he reveal to them his glory? Yes. But what happens is what did they do? They became vain in their imaginations, and what did they start doing with God? Well, he's this, and he's not merciful. Right? He's not gracious. Even though he says, I'm going to put a bow in the clouds, and every time you see the bow, it's going to remind you, it's going to remind me of my mercy. And what is it that man does? It says, okay, we see that, however, I think God is this, this, and this. And so what they've done is they've created a God in their mind, and what happens is, well, I want it to look like this. And so then we create a statue, and then we worship it. Okay? Notice, and change the glory of the uncorruptible God into an image made like to corruptible man. Now, when you think about most idols that you see today, what is it that they look like? People. Notice he says, and to birds, and four-footed beasts, and what? Creeping things. And what happens is, and here you get the idea of how is it that they change the uncorruptible image of God, the glory of God? How is it that they change it? God, man, bird, four-footed beast, creeping thing. Man I can communicate with, but a creeping thing I can do what? If I don't like it, I can get rid of it. Right? That's how, and has God changed it at all? Has his glory changed at all through that? But their perception of what God is and his glory has, right? Notice, here's your wrath. Wherefore God also gave them up. So what happens? You notice that word where it says, wherefore God also gave them up? Notice that word also? Why is it that God gave them up? Because they gave him up first, right? They changed his glory and all that stuff. And it says, God also gave them up to uncleanness through the lust of their own hearts, to dishonor their own bodies between themselves, who changed the truth of God into a lie and worshiped and served the creature more than the Creator. Well, isn't that what we just got through reading about in verse 23? Corruptible man, four-footed beast, and all that stuff. And so then what happens is they worshiped and served the creature more than the Creator, who is blessed forever. Amen. Now, when we take a look at that, that's part of His wrath. I'm going to give you up to uncleanness and the lust of your own hearts. That's part of the wrath. It's not, I'm going to destroy you. It's what? I'm going to give you over to yourself. And if what you want, then you're going to get that. We don't normally think of that as a judgment, but it is. Keep on going. Verse 26. For this cause God gave them up unto vile affections, for even their women did change the natural use into that which is against nature. And likewise also the men, leaving the natural use of the woman, burned in their own lust, one toward another, men with men, working that which is unseemly, and receiving in themselves the recompense of their error, which was meat. Now, that phrase right there, receiving in themselves that recompense of their error, which was meat, what is that? You do something, here's your consequence. I'm not going to change the consequence for you. I'm not going to let you do what you want to do, and then I'm going to make it better for you. Because what are you going to do? I'm going to keep doing it. Because you're just going to fix it. Right? It's the idea of how many times does it take to get pulled over by the police before you get a ticket, and you're like, well, maybe I need to slow down a little bit. Because if you do it 8 times and you're let off, then what's going to happen? I'm going to keep doing it. And what's he saying there is he's saying what? You do those things, what's going to happen? You're going to receive in themselves that recompense of their error, which was meat. Which means what? It's appropriate. If you do this, here's the consequence, and it's going to match. Well, I don't like what happened. It's still fair, right? Because it's going to match. It's appropriate. It's meat. Verse 28, and even as they did not like to retain God in their knowledge. So they went from they knew God to the point where they what? They don't even like to retain God in their knowledge. They said, I don't want anything to do with God. Notice, God gave them over to a reprobate mind to do those things which are not convenient. And He's saying what? If you want to do that, have at it. When consequences come, it's not my fault, it's your fault, because that's the consequence of sin. And what's the ultimate consequence to sin? Death. All right? And that idea, that's what we see. Notice, being filled with all unrighteousness, fornication, wickedness, covetousness, debate, deceit, malignity, whisperers, backbiters, haters of God, despiteful, proud, boasters, inventors of evil things, disobedient to parents, without understanding, covenant breakers, without natural affection, implacable, unmerciful. You just look at that list, you're just like, man, that's the mind of people. By the way, that right there is how we used to think 100% of the time. People that you come in contact with, that's the way they think. So when we go talking to people about things, what do we need to do is know who we're dealing with, right? Notice this. Who, knowing the judgment of God, that they which commit such things are worthy of death, not only do the same, but have pleasure in them that do them. I see it all the time. And that's why is it that our culture is the way that it is? It's because of that right there. The first chapter of the book of Romans will tell you. Why do we have problems everywhere that we look? Romans chapter 1 will tell you. That's part of what God's done. Now, when we go back over here to Genesis chapter 9, Genesis chapter 9, we're seeing the result of these things, right? And that's one of those things. Hopefully, we see those things as we continue going through that. Back here in Genesis chapter 9, he sets this bow up. And it really what it's doing is showing, here's my glory, right? Chapter 9, verse 20. And of course, this is where we talked about some things last week. There's, like I said, I want to do a couple things here real quick before we move on. But notice that Noah began to be an husbandman and planted a vineyard, and he drank of the wine and was drunken, and he was uncovered within his tent. And Ham, the father of Canaan, saw the nakedness of his father and told his two brethren without. And Shem and Japheth took a garment and laid it upon both their shoulders and went backward and covered the nakedness of their father. And their faces were backward, and they saw not their father's nakedness. And of course, we talked about those things when we looked at that last time. Go over to Exodus. My bad. I'm still thinking of that other thing. Go over to Leviticus chapter 20. Like I said, I was planning on talking about this this week, but we already started it last week, so we'll just keep on going with this. Leviticus chapter 20. We looked at some verses last week in Leviticus 18, but I want us to take a look at something else as well. Leviticus chapter 20, and I think this will give us a little bit better idea of what's going on. And of course, when we looked at Leviticus 18 last week, one of the things that we found out was there's some issues. Back up. Well, we're right here. Go to Leviticus 18. We'll get 20 here in a second, but keep these things in mind. Leviticus chapter 18, verse 1, And the Lord spake unto Moses, saying, Speak unto the children of Israel, and say unto them, I am the Lord your God. After the doings of the land of Egypt, wherein ye dwelt, shall ye not do. So what's he saying? Whatever you were doing over in Egypt, don't do that stuff anymore. Now, one of the things we find out, once they leave Egypt, they go across the Red Sea, they get over there, Moses goes up to the mountain, and what is it that Moses finds out when he comes down out of the mountain is you've got all these people that are dancing around this golden calf. And one of the things here we find out is Moses is told, speak to the children of Israel and say what? Things you did in Egypt, don't do them. He goes up in the mountain and he comes down, and what are they doing? things that they saw in Egypt. And he's saying, don't do this. Notice in verse 4, Ye shall do my judgments and keep mine ordinances to walk therein. I am the Lord your God. Ye shall therefore keep my statutes and my judgments, which if a man do, he shall live in them. I am the Lord. Now, stop for a second. Did Israel have the opportunity to not do the things that they were doing over in Egypt? Yes. But what did they choose to do? The things that they were doing over in Egypt. And what happens is part of the wrath of God, what we talked about in Romans, the reason I wanted to bring that up, part of the wrath of God was, I'm going to give you to yourself. But what's he do with Israel? He says, I'm going to give you something to make you separate from the rest of the people. And we'll talk about that once we get back over into Genesis. But that's what he's doing, right? And one of the things that he's doing here is he's setting them apart. And he's saying, after the doings of the land of Egypt wherein you dwell, you shall you not do. And he talks about keeping the judgments, statutes, and all that stuff. And of course, we talked about that issue of, in verse 6, None of you shall approach to any that is near of kin to him to uncover their nakedness. Now, we talked about that issue of being near to them isn't really the issue. What's the issue there is, why is it that they're near of kin to them, the ones that approach it? What's the purpose of them approaching? It's not just they're approaching is the problem, but they're approaching to do something, right? And of course, we talked about that. We went through that a little bit last week, and it was towards the end of the message, and it was in the overtime part, I guess. But it's when you look at those things, it's not them approaching was the problem. The reason they approached is the problem, right? What's the reason that they approached? To uncover their nakedness, right? That's the problem. The why. Why did you do it? Not that you did it, but why did you do it, right? Now, go over to chapter 20. And of course, I wanted us to remind us of what we had there. Notice over here in chapter 20, and what he's doing, again, notice in verse 1, And the Lord spake unto Moses, saying, Now, of course, who's he talking to here? Moses. Did Noah, Shem, Ham, Japheth, and their wives know this information? No. Right? Now, think about what's going on. He's saying, again, verse 2, again, thou shalt say to the children of Israel, whosoever he be of the children of Israel, or of the strangers that sojourn in Israel, that giveth any of his seed unto Molech, he shall surely be put to death. The people of the land shall stone him with stones. Now, of course, once we get over here, we can talk about those things. But notice, and I will set my face against that man, and will cut him off from among his people, because he hath given his seed unto Molech, to defile my sanctuary, and to profane my holy name. And if the people of the land do any ways hide their eyes from the man, when he giveth of his seed unto Molech, and kill him not, then I will set my face against that man and against his family, and will cut him off. Now, you pause and think about that. Here you've got a person who says, what? I'm going to give my child to Molech. God says, what? You're cut off. By the way, you talked to the person, you knew they gave their kid over to Molech, you're cut off. Old Barney Fife right there, right? Nip it in the bud. For those that don't know, Barney Fife, he was on... No? Okay. Yeah, hopefully everybody understands who Barney Fife is. But that was one of his sayings, right? But when you see this, it's this idea of what? Notice, and all that go a whoring after him to commit whoredom with Molech from among their people, and the soul that turneth after such as have familiar spirits, and after wizards to go a whoring after them, I will even set my face against that soul, and will cut him off from among his people. Now, who is it that he's cutting them off from? Israel. These are people who are part of the nation of Israel, and he's saying, when you go after this, what am I going to do to you? You're cut off. And if you allow that, and you partake in it, and you don't say anything to the guy about it, you're cut off. And what he's doing, he's trying to get a point across of what? Don't go be like the Gentiles, following after their gods. And he says, the reason I'm doing these things is to set you apart. Now, of course, we're not there yet in Genesis, right? But we will get there. But I want you to see those things. Notice, keep on going. Drop down to, let's keep reading here. Sanctify yourselves, therefore, and be ye holy. Sanctify yourselves. What's he saying? Set yourself apart from the rest of the people. Be different than the culture around you. That's what he's dealing with, all right? He says, sanctify yourselves, therefore, and be ye holy. By the way, pause. Dispensation of grace. Are you sanctified? Yes. Are you holy? Yes. So when you think about this, he's telling them to do what? Sanctify yourselves and be ye holy. And what he's telling us is what? You can act a certain way because you are sanctified and you are holy. You have the ability to do something. And what's interesting is we see this a little bit later on when it's given to Paul about the real purpose of the law is to do what? You can't be perfect. You can't do it. I'm the one that's going to have to do it for you. And it's interesting because that's what God's going to do. Notice in verse 8, and ye shall keep my statutes and do them. I am the Lord which sanctify you. There we go. And everyone that curseth his father or his mother shall be surely put to death. He hath cursed his father or his mother, his blood shall be upon him. The man that committeth adultery with another man's wife, even he that committeth adultery with his neighbor's wife, the adulterer and adulteress shall surely be put to death. Could you imagine if we were under the law today? You would have a whole lot fewer people walking around, wouldn't you? Huh? No, what?
I said juvenile parlors.
Oh, yeah, they would be. But here's the thing. Do you think that would stop people? No, because it didn't stop them then either. Right? So, verse 11. And the man that lieth with his father's wife hath uncovered his father's nakedness. So, when we have Noah's nakedness uncovered, what does that verse tell us about Shem? Verse 11. And the man that lieth with his father's wife hath uncovered his father's nakedness. Both of them shall surely be what? Question. Was Shem and Noah's wife put to death? Ham, yeah. Ham and Noah's wife put to death? No. What were they shown back there? Mercy.
It depends how you view Ham's lineage, Canaan.
Well, Ham wasn't put to death, because this verse right here tells us that they're going to be put to death, right?
Yeah.
That Ham and Noah's wife should have, if they were under the law, what would have happened to Ham and Noah's wife? But they weren't under the law. And so you didn't have the law yet. And that's why I want us to think about these things. Can we put Ham and Noah's wife under Leviticus chapter 18, 19, 20, and all those? No. But what is it that we learn about Ham and Noah's wife? Were they put to death? They're shown mercy. Now, obviously, when you talk about his son Canaan, which we talked about last week, and I think we all understood, Canaan was the child of Ham and Noah's wife, right? We talked about that last week. So that was cursed. But was Ham's son put to death? Yeah. That's a good question. Would it be worse to be put to death and have no mercy, or to be alive and still be able to have mercy of some sort?
Eternal lineage of slaves or just instant death?
Well, no, it's not an eternal lineage, right? Because we looked at last week, it was Canaan that was cursed.
Yeah, but
Just the son.
and his sons and his sons.
Well, if we look, and we'll go back to that in a second. When you look at that, we'll see that. But what is it that this verse tells us that took place back there in Genesis chapter 9? Right? Ham goes in and lies with his mom. And that's what we see there. Go back to Genesis chapter 9.
Even when you go back to the beginning of this stuff, we said this last week, it always reeks of dispensationalism all throughout the Bible.
It does.
Moment to moment.
From the very beginning, yeah. Yeah. When we, Genesis 9. Genesis chapter 9.
I think it would have to have happened frequent enough for there to be a law for it.
Well, yeah, I mean, there's for God to have to describe, don't do this,
It wasn't just.
it's happened, and it could be very common.
Yeah.
It tells you in Leviticus the source of it was Egypt
Mm-hmm.
and Canaan.
Yeah.
Genesis is telling you the source of that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. And so like that's why I was wanting to go back to Leviticus 18, because and even in 20 there, 18 he says what? The doings over there in Egypt, don't do them.
Which is
So-
the land of Ham.
Mhm.
It says in Psalm a couple of times.
Yeah.
Egypt, the land of Ham.
Mm-hmm. And you get into issues like the world is a type of Egypt, or Egypt's a type of the world, because of all the things that were taking place there, and you see all that stuff show up over and over and over again. But when we're over here in Genesis chapter 9, verse 18, and the sons of Noah that went forth of the ark were Shem, Ham, and Japheth, and Ham is the father of Canaan. These are the three sons of Noah, and of them was the whole earth overspread. And Noah began to be an husbandman, and planted a vineyard, and he drank of the wine, and was drunken, and he was uncovered within his tent. And Ham, the father of Canaan, saw the nakedness of his father, and told his two brethren without. And Shem and Japheth took a garment and laid it upon both their shoulders, and went backward and covered the nakedness of their father, and their faces were backward, and they saw not his father's nakedness. And Noah woke from his wine, and knew that what his younger son had done unto him, and he said, Cursed be Ham, Canaan, right? Canaan, a servant of servants shall he be unto his brethren. So who is it that, what happens here is he says what? Cursed be who? Canaan. So Noah knows what's going on. We talked about that last week. And what does Noah do? He curses Canaan. Now, when you think about this, you keep on going, he says, and he said, blessed be the Lord God of Shem, and Canaan shall be his servant. God shall enlarge Japheth, and he shall dwell in the tents of Shem, and Canaan shall be his servant. And Noah lived after the flood 350 years, and all the days of Noah were 950 years, and he died, which is a continuation of chapter 5. So when we look at this, who is it that curses Canaan? Noah does. So there's other things that go along with that as well.
It almost sounds like Canaan is already there,
Yeah,
but he's not.
yeah.
Has there been an extended period of time to go by?
That I don't know if we see. I don't. Other than the fact that you have Canaan here, and Noah knows Canaan's here, and he curses Canaan. And of course, again, it's not God cursing Canaan, right? And his seed and all that stuff. Who's being cursed there is Canaan. Who's cursing him? Noah.
Canaan's the big one too, isn't it? In the sense that he didn't do it.
Well, he's the. Hold that thought. When we were looking at Romans 1, and this is one of the reasons why I wanted to bring this up too. Hold your place there and look at this. Romans chapter 1. When he's bringing up that issue in the second, where you've got that first, God also gave them up, and the second one, God gave them up in verse 26. For this cause God gave them up unto vile affections, for their women did change the natural use into that which is against nature, and likewise also men with men, leaving the natural use of the woman, burning their lust one toward another, which men with men, working that which is unseemly, receiving in themselves the recompense of their error, which was meat. When you think about Canaan is the offspring of what? A really bad decision. Right? He is what? The recompense of their error. And there's something that is with that. And of course, part of that, of Noah cursing them, that's that recompense of their error. They're getting what they deserved by doing what they did. Now, would you say Canaan would be a victim in that? I don't know about that, but I see what you're saying in that. That's a good question. It's a good question. I'll put that in the back of my mind. Think about that one. But it's what? That's the consequence of what they did. Yeah.
I mean, of course, there's a lot of things that are not mentioned, but I mean,
Yeah.
of course, the Canaanites came from Canaan,
Mm-hmm.
and presumably Canaan learned from his father, who did wickedness. So Canaan seemingly continued that wickedness. So maybe Noah was also cursing.
Well, that's also a consequence of that, right? And of course, if you're gonna, you have two choices. You can either raise your children up the right way or the wrong way, right? And then the result of you teaching them the wrong way, what are they going to do? They're going to fall in that wrong way. But again, the idea here that I want us to see in Genesis 9 is who's cursed is Canaan, and he'll be a servant of servants. Shall he be unto his brethren? And again, like I said, Noah's the one that's doing that. In verse 26, and he said, blessed be the Lord God of Shem, and Canaan shall be his servant. God shall enlarge Japheth, and he shall dwell in the tents of Shem, and Canaan shall be his servant. And again, you see that issue of the servitude there to the other two brethren, right?
That's strictly regarding these people, not the descendants.
I wouldn't think so because of what we've got there. No, and that's fine, because that's normally what we think of, right? Because at this time we're looking at that seed line, right? And of course we're thinking in that term, and that's why I was like, when we look at the verse is going to tell us Noah's the one that curses Canaan, and Canaan's going to be a servant to Shem and to Japheth there.
I mean, this may be a little bit of a stretch, but they did technically become servants to sin almost at that point, that lineage.
Yeah, and that's to Raymond's point. That's what that is, and that's that idea of, well, if you raise your kids up that way, you're going to expect them to go worse and worse and worse, right?
For sure. And then you also got to consider, like, I assume Cain was probably bitter about being, deemed a servant his whole life. Like,
Yeah, he's not like, well, I'm going to be the best servant ever. You know, yeah,
Everything's in
yeah,
servants.
yeah.
And when it says, a servant of servants to his brother,
Hmm.
well, he has other brothers.
He has other brothers, yeah.
Right, so he's gonna be a servant in his own family and then also a servant to his
Uncles and cousins and all those too, yeah. Yeah. And that's what I would see in those verses. I think that's what the verses are telling us, yeah. So is that a little clear? Yeah.
This is news to me, so I'm still digesting.
Okay. Yeah, you weren't here last week.
I wasn't here
Yeah.
last week, so I'm catching up. Ham,
Mm-hmm.
the father of Canaan, so he's already got a son,
Mhm.
Canaan,
Mm-hmm.
saw the nakedness of his father, which we are now presuming to be his mother.
Yeah.
He has an Oedipus relationship with his mother at this point.
Mm-hmm.
He has, and then Noah wakes up from his wine. Noah's his younger son has had relations with his wife
Mm-hmm.
and curses the son that she has already born
Mm-hmm.
at some point.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
He didn't curse him before then.
Well,
He just,
That-
that's twice now, and that's too much, I guess.
no. And that's what, to Randy's question, how much time has elapsed, right? And we're not privy to how much time's elapsed, but what do we know? Canaan's there.
And Noah is aware that this is not his son.
Yeah.
At some point, Noah's figured this out.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
This is, yeah, I'm still digesting.
No, you're good. You're good.
Okay, I'm getting confused now because when it says the father of Canaan, it does not mean he already exists.
No.
It's introducing him. That's
Yeah,
what it sounds
okay.
like he
And
was
then it
saying,
started
that there's
explaining the story.
Yeah.
already a person named Canaan in existence. No, Canaan
Oh, yeah.
is
No, it
the
has to be.
result.
It has to be.
No.
Because he says, cursed be Canaan.
Well, there's a
Well, he does
gap.
that later.
There's a
right.
gap. There has to be a gap after verse 24. There's gaps everywhere that we're not told about.
Yeah.
But he's introducing him because we know who was on the ark, and Canaan was not.
Canaan wasn't there.
Canaan-
Right, I agree with that.
Right, and we know that the person born after the flood was Shem's son. So, I mean, there wasn't a person in existence named Canaan at this time when this took place. It's an introduction to who Ham is.
Yeah.
It's written in retrospect for your knowledge.
Yeah.
So
It
rather
doesn't
than saying,
exist yet.
Yeah.
rather than saying cursed be the offspring of this relationship, he's naming the child.
He doesn't name it.
Yeah, he doesn't
until
name until later
after
on.
he's born.
Yeah. Because you've got and I see where you're thinking there. So when he's talking about it in verse 18, you got Shem, Ham, and Japheth. Ham is the father of Canaan. It's not that Canaan's already there, right? Canaan comes after, really verse 22, right? Because Noah or Ham goes in, sees has the nakedness of his father, which he's lying with his mother. And again, that's how Ham is referred to as the father of Canaan, right? And then Canaan is the one in verse 25 who's later on he's actually birthed, right? Because again, it's the idea is he's talking about something that's already taken place. Ham's the father of Canaan. That's who he's going to be. And once you see Canaan, we know where he came from. And he's explaining where Canaan came from.
It's writing in the present. Ham, the father of Canaan, not the future father, not the,
Mhm.
I'm just having a hard time with the,
No, you're good.
It's just telling you who his identity
Yeah.
is and who the man Ham is known as.
Yeah.
He is the father of Canaan.
That's his
This is
identification.
Okay.
1800
give
years
me,
after
give
this.
me
Yeah.
a few minutes. Let me-
Yeah.
No, you're good. You're good. Because
It's telling you.
but that's his identification. Here's how you know who Ham is. Ham's the father of Canaan. All right? He's telling us that right there in verse 18. And of course, when Moses is writing this has already taken place a long time ago, right? And he's saying, so even when Moses writes it later, he's saying Ham is the father of Canaan. So everybody that Moses was around, when he says Canaan, they know who Canaan is and they know who Ham is now.
Okay.
right? And that connection there. And then in verse 22, again, it's an issue of he's saying, and Ham, the father of Canaan, almost like a definition. Here's who he is, right? Here's who Ham is. Where did Ham come from? Well, verse 23. Or where did Canaan come from is verse 23. And he's explaining to us who he was, who Ham is. Canaan comes from verse 22 and 23 right there.
Well, it answers questions why he's cursing the grandson and not the son.
Yeah.
It kind of closes that, but I'm just still
Yeah.
carrying on. I'm sorry.
No, you're good. You're good. And so then in 25 you've got Canaan that shows up.
Conversation last
Yeah, you missed all the confusing last week. So. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, and that's okay.
It talks about Judas.
Huh?
New Testament, Judas, he's, a lot of times he's described as the.
He's
betrayer of
introduced
Christ.
as the one that betrayed.
Right.
Yeah.
Before that.
Yeah. Yeah.
That happens.
It's the same kind of idea. Yeah. I see what you're saying now. All right. I see what yeah. What were you thinking, Dave? That's all right.
That tells you how.
No. And again, he knew.
Spans of time there.
Yeah.
It obviously didn't happen immediately.
Yeah. It's not like he woke up and was like, wait a minute, you're pregnant all of a sudden. You've got a kid that's going to be coming 9 months from now, and I know, yeah. So and again, there's so, huh? Either one, but I mean, yeah, he told his brother. But here's the thing too, and again, one of the things, yeah. I mean that's the natural thing, I guess, right? And Paul deals with the guy over in Corinth that does the same thing, right? So anyway, but here's the thing too, and again, you know, we talked about this when we started off on this. The first 11 chapters of Genesis covers 2,000 years of time, which, when we think about it, the last from chapter 12 on is about 350 years. And so what that tells me is there's a lot of stuff in 2,000 years that's going to take place that we're not going to get every detail on, even though we want. And that's kind of tough for us to do because, like I've said, even when we're going through this, our idea is we want to stay up here. I want to get into this stuff. I love it. I love the fact that we're getting into it. But thinking those things through, right? There's a lot of stuff we don't know how much time has passed here. I would imagine at least 9 months, if not more, right? Between verse 23 and verse 24, 25 in there, something else is taking place, right? There's some time period that's taking place. How much time, we don't know. And it's that same idea of everything in Scripture. You know, there's certain things, we're just not told everything we need to know, but what do we know? Noah knew it, and he said, I'm going to curse the offspring of this thing that shouldn't have taken place.
So did he have authority to do that cursing?
I would see that he would have.
Additional thing?
I think that he would have, as him being, yeah, as the, well, in a way, right? Because he wasn't told like Adam to have dominion and subdue, right? So he wasn't really given the authority of, but Noah was a just man, righteous in his generation, right? So he has this authority, I think, because of what he's done. He's got that already. Yeah. Yeah. Huh? And that's possible too. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
Well, our fathers generally given authority over the family.
They are. Yeah.
I mean,
I mean, you got to think.
curse or not curse, that, you know, right or wrong, I don't know about that, but I mean, when you raise children, you tend to do those types of things.
Yeah. And
Why did he jump on the offspring that had no choice? Because he had other brothers.
but again, that's why I brought up the Romans 1. It's meat. The punishment matches what took place.
But Ham did the deed.
He did.
Canaan didn't have anything to do with it.
But he's the offspring of that. So but I see what you're saying, yeah. And that's,
Sins transfers to you, is that kind of what?
well, that's that same idea, right? You've got, and in Scripture you see that often, that the transgressions are passed on, the consequences and all that stuff, right?
Simple as God appointed it that way.
I would think,
Not to oversimplify it.
It sounds like to me Noah was just upset.
and it's possible, but he had the ability to say, you're not, when you talk about that issue of being cursed, it's that idea of being cut off, right? You're now a servant.
His offspring went on to build cities and have their own land.
Yeah.
So they weren't actually serving their brothers in a traditional way, but maybe it was a disrespect thing that God put on. I don't know.
I don't know about that, but I mean, just based on the verses, I think that we see he is a servant of servants and things like that. He's going to be a servant to his brother and all that. I mean, we see that and how that goes about. But I think because we see this here, we do see that he had the authority to do so, and he made sure that it was that way. Yeah.
It leads me back to the question I asked previously, which was worse, and it makes me think that your son being cursed to be a servant is worse than you being killed, because, I mean, it's hard for me to really assess, but like, man, being told like your son's gonna eternally be a servant sounds like pretty harsh punishment, and like you were saying, we don't really know the full extent and mercy of God, but then God decreed that, you know, it shall be death, that shall be the punishment. So it's almost like death is the lesser of the punishment than your son being cursed for his whole life.
Well, I think this is more of a merciful thing that he's not put to death.
Oh, you do? Maybe. I can
Because
see it going either way.
because here's the thing, if I end your life, you no longer have an opportunity to get any other mercy or grace or anything like that. But if you're still alive, you still have an opportunity to. Because again, it's not God that does this, says, okay, I'm going to curse Canaan. Noah's the one that does it.
Yeah, but the mercy wasn't withheld from his son, though.
Huh?
But the mercy wasn't given to his son, though. I mean, if you're asking.
Well,
father,
no, I know. I see what you're saying. Yeah.
He would prefer being given mercy or prefer his son being given mercy. I think.
It'd be the
throughout
son.
history, fathers have proven they would prefer their son.
And that's part of a judgment on Ham.
Yeah, well, that's what I'm saying.
Yeah. Yeah.
I think it was a harsher punishment.
For Ham, yeah.
Yeah.
I see what you're saying.
About the confusion that would ensue, though, his mother is his grandmother.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, seriously, think about, and then it's Ham's firstborn,
Yeah.
and that's where the blessing is supposed to go.
Yeah.
It can't go to him because he's born in this illegitimate relationship where his grandmother is his mother.
Yeah.
And that is a curse in and of itself.
Yeah. Well, his dad's his brother, too.
Right. I mean, it's just,
Wow.
and so all of the things that God sets up for the way things to function can't function now because of what
Because
he's
of that.
done, ever. And that's why he can't be honored.
Mm-hmm.
So,
And I think that's why when you get over to Leviticus 18, 19, and 20, again, you got to think, we've got 8 people here. There's going to have to be some guy and his cousin, but you don't have that by the time you get to Leviticus, and God says, we're going to put an end to that, and here's how we're going to put an end to it. But you don't do that. That you don't do.
But that's like Abraham in the 12th chapter.
Yeah.
He was done with the Gentiles. He was done
Yeah.
with Abraham.
And that's what we see in chapter 10. You start saying, here's all the Gentiles. And then, of course, a little bit later on, we get to Abraham, and he pulls him out of that. And he's going to do, I'm going to do something different. Now, again, all those things that you see in Leviticus 18, 19, and 20 that we looked at, all that stuff takes place out there in the Gentiles, and God says, that has no place with my people. Right?
Should I gather that up until the time of Leviticus and the laws,
Mm-hmm.
this was continued?
Yeah.
There really was no, and I mean, there was no difference between first cousin or eighth cousin or 12th cousin or brother and sister, just not with mother and father. And
Well,
should I gather
I-
this just continued? up
I would
until-
think that there would have been, I mean, again, I said, we've got 8 people here, right? They're going to have children. Their children are going to have to
Yeah, yeah.
intermingle and marry and have their children too.
Adam and Eve's children.
Same thing, yeah.
I
So, I
just
mean-
always wondered when that finally ended, and I think you.
I think that's where God said, and it's part of Israel's going to be different because they're not going to do what the Gentiles are doing, and the Gentiles to this day still do it. You know, the old joke, you don't go to Eastern Kentucky because you might find your grandfather or something like that, that's your grandson too. Like they're, you know, but that's that same thing. Gentiles were still doing all that stuff, and God's saying, that's not to be so here. Right? And I think that's that. No, we ain't going to do West Virginia. We got West Virginia people here, man.
Call us Southern Kentucky where we came from, so.
Okay, I
We'll call it Tennessee.
no more entertaining assembly than this anywhere.
Well, I don't know if that's a good thing or a bad thing. But yeah.
Rodham and I were talking last week, and we're fairly certain that the writers of like Jerry Springer and Ari read Genesis 9:18, and they were like, "This is gold."
Yeah.
Where it's like, and Ham is the father of Canaan.
Yeah.
We read that and we were like, okay, well, this
That's Maury Povich and all that stuff all wrapped into one, right? Yeah.
So if y'all want something really entertaining, Ray Stevens wrote a song called I'm My Own Grandpa.
Yeah.
Because of his intermarrying and those, it's hilarious.
It's pretty good. And it makes sense if you don't think about it. But yeah, he did.
It comes with a diagram.
Yeah, it does. It does. And it works out. Yeah. Yeah. You know how certain plants, when they grow and the limbs get down and they touch the ground and they sprout up another one, that's what that is. So all right. Well, are we satisfied with chapter 9?
We are satisfied with it.
I didn't plan on spending that much time on it, but that's fine. I'm fine with that. But there's a lot of things in there, like I said, that we're not privy to. And again, I think there's a reason why, because you got 2,000 years covered, and God's saying, here's how things are going to work, but I'm not going to get into the details like I am with the rest of the chapters in Genesis, right? And moving on. So, all right. So next week, you can start reading. If you've not been reading, keeping up, you can go ahead and read chapters 10 and 11, kind of keep ahead that way. There's some really interesting things in chapter 10 and obviously chapter 11, and that gets us closer and closer to chapter 12, where God starts doing some things slightly different. Yeah.